Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this panel conversation on how we can better shield civilians from harm in times of conflict. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this very important conversation. We will be here together for 45 minutes to discuss current realities, identify gaps in the protection framework for civilians in conflict, and reflect on innovative citizen-centered approaches with the aim of making recommendations to optimally protect civilians. In the next 45 minutes while we are here having this important conversation, it is estimated that 12 babies would have been killed in conflict across the world. The numbers of civilian casualties, avoidable civilian casualties, I must emphasize, is alarming. In 2021, the Secretary General, in his State of the Protection of Civilians report, recorded that 11,000 civilians were killed across conflicts in the world, specifically in 12 armed conflicts in the world. These numbers, of course, are underestimates and do not include the civilian deaths that have occurred in the war in Ukraine, in Ethiopia, and a whole lot of other places across the globe. Beyond these casualty numbers, armed conflicts have displaced millions of people inside and outside of their border, deprived them of livelihood, put their dreams on hold, and created unimaginable mental harm, most of the time without any meaningful amend or accountability. Every day we hear horrifying stories, how women and children are being treated as spoils of war and exploited physically and sexually. It should not be so. The nature and forms of conflict tell us clearly that we're all implicated. Our world is vulnerable. Today's survivors can, of course, be tomorrow's victims. Great power conflicts are looking more likely, and we are seeing conflicts coming closer to our doors. The urgency of this moment is really existential. Armed conflicts are no longer distant reality. They are close to cities in Paris, London, New York, and many other places that before now we never imagined they might be implicated in this kind of armed conflict. We need to protect all of us here and create a stronger protection framework for every human being on this planet. At the Center for Civilians in Conflict, Civic, where I work, we believe that civilian harm is not an unavoidable consequence of conflict. We believe that civilians can and should be protected from harm in conflict, and this should be the priority. Thankfully, we have a very exciting panel to help us delve into this conversation. With me here is Nadia Murad, founder of Nadia Initiative. Also, Solomon Ayele Deso, founding director, Amani Africa, and member of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Natalia Karboska, director on strategic development, empowering women of Ukraine for peace building. Thanks so much for making the effort to be here. And of course, Sarah Eprecht, director of protection and essential services, International Committee of the Red Cross. Thank you so much for being here. And so let's get into it. Sarah, I come to you. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, questions are being asked over the relevance of the international humanitarian law. Some suggest that the law should be updated. Some even go as far as saying maybe it shouldn't be there in the first place. As the guardian of the international humanitarian law, how is the International Red Cross responding to these concerns? And do you think that international humanitarian law as we know it is adequate to our times?
Thank you very much for this question. It's an absolute privilege to be here today. It's really important that we're taking the time to speak about the protection of civilians when you look at what's happening across the world today. The short answer to your question, which is essentially, is international humanitarian law still relevant today? The short answer to that is absolutely. It's absolutely still relevant today. When we see what happens every day to too many people in too many parts of the world, people experiencing things that most of us here are lucky enough to only have heard or seen or read about from afar. Children being separated from their families, family members going missing, people getting injured, killed, subjected to abhorrent forms of violence, sexual violence, too rampant in conflict, not to mention the destruction of homes, livelihoods, hospitals, schools, infrastructure, people who are no longer able to access essential services. I mean, these are horrific situations, and they're also situations that IHL is intending to protect against. So perhaps, going into, is it adequate, is it not, I think it's also important to ground ourselves in what are we actually talking about here? What is it about IHL that is so important in the protection of civilians? And maybe just to zoom in on one or two of the key fundamental points. And one being that, okay, IHL is about distinction. So parties to a conflict, the rules of IHL say they must distinguish between legitimate military objectives and civilians. Civilians can't be targeted, they have to be spared. Another key fundamental element being that people who are not participating in the conflict, civilians, people who are wounded, prisoners of war, that they must be respected. It's a basic rule of respect, being treated humanely, ensuring that things like torture don't happen. Torture is prohibited. So I think it'd be hard-pressed to say that these rules aren't relevant. And in fact, if the rules that exist were respected, the vast majority of the kind of situations that I just mentioned before wouldn't occur in the first place. So essentially, at the end of the day, the question isn't so much, is IHL itself relevant or not? It's how do we ensure the respect of IHL more than what we see around the world today? And I just maybe to say one last point, just to say that it is the obligation of states and parties to a conflict to ensure respect of IHL. It's not the humanitarian organizations, local organizations, first responders. We are there to help. We can do a lot to also support authorities in ensuring respect, but ultimately, it is their responsibility as well. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, your point is very clear, it is relevant. But let me come to you, Solomon. Africa has been immersed in conflicts. We have devastating armed conflicts in Ethiopia, in DRC, in Mali, in Somalia, in Nigeria, in Mozambique. You have been the president of the African Commission. You are currently a member of the Commission. In your view, how effective has the protection of civilians been in these conflicts? And what should the world, AU, and those of us here, what should we be doing differently at this time?
Thank you. Yes, the norms relating to protection of civilians are immensely important, perhaps more today than in previous eras, for a number of reasons. One, as your question makes clear, we are experiencing on the continent a rising number of conflicts and also a spread in the geographic scope of conflicts on the continent, mostly on account also of particular kind of non-state armed groups, such as, for example, terrorist groups, As you can see from some of the hotspots in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, in the Lake Chad Basin, in northern Mozambique. These are groups that actually operate on the basis of a certain ways of conducting and using violence, which are completely contrary to the fundamentals of international humanitarian law, such as the principle of distinction, for example. So the challenge for protection of human rights, civilians, is enormous at this point in time. And it's important to remember that one of the factors that led to the establishment of the African Union from the Organization of African Unity was the experiences of challenge relating to protection of civilians, including the occurrence of the genocide in 1994 against the Tutsis in Rwanda. It is that propelled the transition from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. And at the core of it, one of the promises of the African Union is basically to put in place institutions and frameworks that are directed to enhance the protection of civilians. That is why you have the African Peace and Security Architecture. That's why you have, for example, the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, which is, the counterpart to the Security Council. That takes decisions on, among other things, ensuring protection of civilians in conflict situations as it responds to conflict of various kinds, the conflicts that you made reference to. And I think it's worth noting that it's not just the nature of non-state actors that's a problem. You have a problem of disinformation and misinformation, which all conflict actors, including state actors, participate in, thereby making the enforcement of IHL and other relevant rules for the protection of civilians much more difficult. You have the use of new technologies of warfare, such as drones, which basically also have the consequence of making civilians collateral damage, so to speak, sometimes deliberately civilians being targeted. Various justifications and excuses are given, such as, for example, in this time it's difficult to make a distinction between combatants and civilians, and therefore, conflict parties going about using violence in the name of not being able to make distinction between civilians and combatants. But irrespective of the challenge, it is incumbent on conflict parties that they abide by and they observe the norms of protection of civilians, respect for civilians. Unfortunately, polarization in some of the conflict settings, such as in Ethiopia, for example, has created a situation in which the bodies of civilians and civilian infrastructure has itself become the theater on which
Hold that thought. I want to add another layer of question to that, because now you're talking about how civilians and citizens are responding to this situation. But I want to also add to, as you're explaining this, in terms of the voices of civil society, has it been powerful? Has it been coordinated? And how can they better be involved in ensuring that parties to conflict actually abide by this framework and norms?
So there are various ways of doing this. One is using the various norms and institutions at the level of the African Union in order to leverage these norms and institutions in terms of bringing, the various risks of violations to civilians, for example. This is based on data and analysis from communities by identifying what kind of protection risks exist in the different conflict settings. And on the basis of that, to inform policymaking in order for tailor-made interventions to be, to be designed and implemented. You also need to mainstream into various interventions at the national, at the regional and continental levels. In terms of, for example, when you initiate peacemaking efforts, when you initiate mediation, do you factor in considerations of protection of civilians to be part and parcel of the discussion, and even the terms of reference of the mediators and the peacemakers. Whenever you initiate investigation missions as well, okay? Also, do you include the monitoring and reporting of incidents of violations of civilians? The need, for example, for having access to information, which is so critical. We have seen it in the case of the conflict in Tigray in Ethiopia, for example, where the lesser access to information you have, the more difficult it becomes to know what is happening to civilians and therefore to initiate the necessary protection to civilians. So these are the kinds of actions that are required from civil society actors, from communities, and indeed media. The role of the international community shouldn't be forgotten, particularly given that international actors do have influence on some of the conflict actors, including those involving states actors.
Thank you so much, Solomon. And he's talked about what civil society needs to do. And so I come to you, Natalia. First, thank you so much for making this trip. All the way from Ukraine, I know it was difficult, but we're really glad you're here. And thank you also for the work you're doing for the voices of women in conflict. I think it's really, really very important. But tell us, what has been your experience in championing this inclusive approach to protecting civilians and ensuring that the voices of women are heard in the process of restoration and rebuilding and managing the conflict in Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I will probably start with, you said at the beginning about internally displaced persons, right? About IDPs, and there are millions of IDPs in Ukraine. I'm always thinking that behind the numbers, there are individual stories. There are individuals. I am one of them. I became an IDP on February 24th this year, when I had to flee from my home to basically nowhere without knowing what will happen with me, with my family, with my kids, and with my grandchild. And my organization, Ukrainian Women's Fund, has been working with women, supporting women, and for 22 years already. And we have been working, supporting women IDPs since the first stage of this war, since 2014. And believe me, it is completely different experience when you experience this yourself. You see this from a different angle. You know how it works on practice. And it is well known in the world, not only in Ukraine, that those who are vulnerable are becoming even more vulnerable during the times of wars and conflicts. Those who are poor are becoming even more poor. And these are usually women. In Ukraine and in Africa, in different parts of the world, these are women. And what we see is that the systems that are created by the governments, by international organizations, by donors, they are not working properly for women IDPs. And the reason why they are not working properly, they are not as effective as they should be, is because women IDPs and other vulnerable groups of women, they are not involved in the development of these systems. So this is what we are doing in the Ukrainian Women's Fund. We do believe in the power of bottom-up approach. We do believe in the fact that those who are suffering, they know the solutions. They just need a space to bring these solutions, platforms, to bring these solutions to the tables where decisions are made. And this is what we also provide them through work in communities, with women activists, with women IDPs, with those who are suffering from this war, but also those who know the solutions. We are empowering them, we are training them, we are providing rapid response grants for them. For many of them, these are the first grants that they ever received in their lives. And after this, they are starting to create their own organizations, and during the movement, they become a really huge force. And also, we are creating these tables at the local level. When women come together with decision makers, come together with security and defense sector representatives, come together with the media to offer their solutions, to present them, and to advocate together for the more effective policies.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your courage and for the amazing work that you're doing. And, you know, when I'm listening to you and seeing the number of activities you are carrying out, I would want to ask, it's a good thing you have this platform. What kind of support do you need? How can the world better build on the agency of women in situations of conflict?
Well, first of all, I think we all should stop thinking about women only as about the victims of wars and conflicts. If we only see women as victims, we will never see them as leaders, as those who know the solutions. So the paradigm should change. And I think, you know, all those who are making decisions should understand this. Another important thing is that we need these tables where women can sit together with decision makers at the different levels. And very importantly, these tables should be convenient to sit at, not only for those who are making decisions. Another important thing is, you know, no matter how good policy you develop at the international level or national level, if it doesn't work in reality, if it doesn't work at the local level, then these are just words on paper. So localization is very important. And for this, we do believe at the Ukrainian Women's Fund, there is a huge role in localization for civil society, for women's rights organizations, for the movement. And therefore, another important thing that we need is support to civil society. More, better, flexible, long-term political support and strategic support to civil society.
Thank you so much. More support, flexible, and long-term. I think that's the key word there for me. And you talk about women not being victims, but survivors. And so I come to you. You have a remarkable story. You've had a remarkable journey. Non-state armed groups are one of the critical contributors to civilian harm. And a lot of people struggle on how to engage them. You've lived that experience, and I want you to just share how you think we, all of us here, international organizations, NGOs, how we can better interact with non-state armed groups to get the optimal protection for civilians.
Well, thank you so much for the question, and it's great to be with you all. Engaging with non-state armed groups is so complex because they are so varied. There is not even an agreed upon the definition of non-state armed groups under international law. So there's not one solution that will fit all contexts. From a survivor's perspective, I can tell you that the distinctions between state and non-state actors mean little in the midst of conflict. And we have seen throughout the history that both have violated the international humanitarian law with impunity. And I think, and we can see that they have used sexual violence as a weapon of war, and again with impunity. And I think we should think about it that no matter who is committing these crimes, if it's a terrorist group or is it a military force, they must be held accountable. You know, the world leaders, they respond very quickly to condemn what ISIS did or like other groups like Boko Haram or others, but what systems have they put it in place to reach a way that, we can prevent this. Accountability. For me and my whole village, we were surrounded by ISIS for 2 weeks. Close to 2,000 people for 2 weeks were surrounded by ISIS. And just by refusing to not convert or change their religion, the entire male population was murdered within hours, including 6 of my brothers. And these people could have been protected when for 2 weeks we were calling upon the international community, international NGOs. We had our phones, we were connected to the world, and we were saying that ISIS are coming to us and they are wailing. They were so proud and they shared their intent to commit a genocide and sexual violence against my community just because of our beliefs, and nothing was done to protect us. But even after that, it's been 8 years, since ISIS attacked the Yazidi and committed genocide, and we still have 2,800 women and children missing in captivity. My niece, she was 4 weeks old when she was taken into captivity, and today she's 8 years old in captivity if she's alive. The international community was not ready to it's not willing until now to put resources and dedicate resources to look for the missing women and children. So how can you see the difference between state and non-state when one is committing the crimes and the other is not protecting, are not holding them accountable? And it is widely accepted that accountability is a crucial tool to prevent future atrocities against others. And we have failed in the past. We have failed with the Yazidis. We have failed with the women and girls with Boko Haram. We have failed in Afghanistan. And now we are seeing the same thing and the same failure happening in Ukraine. There were clear signs of conflict coming out from Ukraine before the war started. But what did we do to prevent it? Nothing. Nothing. We have thousands of testimonies. We have thousands of documents. We have thousands of testimonies from survivors collected by UNITAD team, a team from a UN team investigating in ISIS crimes. And so far, only 2 ISIS members have been held accountable. And Germany is the only nation that have done that. But there were thousands and thousands of them.
Let me jump in. So I was going to ask you what has the response been when you call for support to survivors. But I'm hearing from what you've said already, a lot is not happening. Just briefly, what needs to happen today to change this situation?
So much is needed. It takes a lot more to reconstruct than to destroy. Because when people are destroyed, so much is needed to make sure that they can get back on their feet. 2 weeks ago, I was in Iraq, in Sinjar, and I talked to hundreds of survivors. Hundreds of families for 8 years are still waiting for their loved ones to be exhumed from mass graves. Families are waiting for their loved ones to be rescued from captivity. Hundreds of tens of thousands of people have returned to Sinjar. They are determined to rebuild, to, start their life, rebuild their lives, but there's no much is going, resources and services, and there's no accountability. And then you have these foreign militia groups who are on the ground, but also recruiting children, brainwashing them and recruiting them and destroying what has left from ISIS again. So it is really important that we focus on we know that there was an immediate response to in the aftermath of genocide, and there was support sending to the displacement camps. But now it's been over 8 years, and people are still displaced, only 2 hours away from their homeland, and traffickers are taking advantage of them. And it's so important that the international community and the international organization focus on more sustainable solutions.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. before I open it up to the audience for questions, I want to come back to you, Sarah. What are you learning from all this conflict? And what do you think is the way to better support the agencies of group, like a group, in fighting for their own protection?
It's been extremely rich and moving to listen to all of my companions here in the panel. Well, I mean, something that we've always known, of course, is that civilians, communities are their own first responders, as well as those who know best. And Natalia, you said it very well, about needs and possible solutions. And Nadia, you were mentioning, some of the things that we need to be paying attention to, like in the post-conflict, the issue of missing persons, which runs so deeply. Things like mental health, psychosocial support for survivors in contextualized manner, and the importance of civil society as well in supporting communities, survivors, to bring them back to a place of dignity and health as well. So we've always known that. Where we've seen a shift is in how we are working in context of conflict more closely with local actors, with civil society, with survivors, and with different groups, and really making a concerted effort to reach out to, within communities, those who are perhaps the most marginalized or whose voices are not as easily heard, people who are perhaps stigmatized or otherwise, somehow might fall through the cracks. So we are making an effort to shift in that way of working, and it's extremely important. Our natural kind of partners, the International Committee of the Red Cross, our natural partners are the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement national societies that are present in most of the places where we work. And there it's a very rich source as well of partnership. And we need to go beyond that, and also to extend these kinds of working together with other local actors. So this is something, I mean, very important learning, and it's also ultimately it's about an international organization like ours also being accountable to the people, that we are there also to serve and to respond to really as best we can. And I say as best we can because we also aren't able to respond always where we don't have access, where we aren't able to reach out to groups responsible. We're talking about non-state armed groups, very difficult also to find effective ways to influence and to engage with non-state armed groups to ensure respect of international humanitarian law, to avoid these abhorrent kind of situations that you have just described. There is a lot to learn in every conflict, but I mean, just a few points there.
Thank you so much. I mean, we're hard pressed for time, but we've got some time for questions and comments from the audience. If you want to ask a question, you want to make a contribution, can you please raise your hand? I can't see behind me. Okay, please. Yeah. I know. Can you collect the microphone?
Wait.
There is a question behind you. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I'm behind you. Hello, everyone. Well, that was very fruitful and insightful discussion. Thank you very much, everyone. My question will be for all the speakers. We've seen that international community of states have told a lot, and Sister Nadia have mentioned about the mercy of how Yazidi community is struggling today. I'm hearing myself. I need to take this away. Sorry. I have heard that, like the issue, for example, of the Yazidi community, we have 17 countries around the world have recognized the genocide, and have shown great solidarity and promises. And that's what maybe me, myself, as a survivor of 2014 genocide, and my sister Nadia Murad understand in the ground how things are limited of going toward bigger change and bigger healing of this society. But then we're coming to other conflict emerging, Ukrainian, other conflict in other continents. What are the promises of international community actually to overcome this? Are we going to just leave Afghani issue unsolved, Iraqi issues unsolved, Syrian issue unsolved, and put light on Ukrainian? And that's what we today see. I'm not saying that I'm underestimating what's going to our brothers and sisters in Ukraine. I'm one of them, a very committed person of this crisis with the Ukrainian refugee, welcoming them and finding solution. We do share the struggle, but how about this different level of dealing and putting into effort of solving? I would be very appreciative if any one of you answer, and if everyone can give a word about this. Like, I'm myself a refugee in France. I really feel that I'm a second-level refugee now. You know, this is something I have felt. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's true. My question to all of you, and thank you, and that was very helpful to listen to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Take us, Solomon. Okay.
I think I would like to say that not paying attention to and applying international norms in the same way to different conflict settings had a tendency to create a vacuum and therefore impunity. So a vacuum and impunity that is created in one part of the world sets a precedent for other parts of the world. And therefore, if you give attention to the situation in Ukraine, questions have been asked from other parts of the world. Is the life of others, as he mentioned, any less important? Whether it is those who are caught up in the fire, whether it is the displaced ones, as he said, are we having a hierarchy of displaced people? Some are treated better than others. And this obviously challenged at its core international norms and institutions, and indeed the international system. So it is extremely important that the media gives as much attention to the plight and suffering of civilians in other parts of the world as well. If you scan through media coverage, headlines on civilians being caught in violence, you would find that more than half of them, that is the minimum, on a daily basis cover what is happening in Ukraine. You would find in other parts of the world much horrific incidents of violations in conflict settings being covered only by one or two media houses. The same thing in terms of the response. What is the amount of finance that is being mobilized in order to support Ukrainians who need and should be supported? Is there a possibility for mobilizing a fraction of that to other parts where civilians are caught in similar kind of situation, if not worse?
Thank you.
So these are really the issues that need to be addressed.
Very, very important point to raise about the way we provide support and what it tells the world about our values. And I know earlier in the opening ceremony, Her Majesty made a great point that sometimes it's not about resources, but maybe about our own bigotry, the way we look at these issues. So we'll take the second question.
Hello.
Please go ahead.
My name is Pashtun Zirak, and I'm from Afghanistan. I'm a student in Science School. I just have a question about Ukraine. We have sympathy with Ukraine, and we know better what Afghan is suffering from last 45 years in Afghanistan. The same situation is now in Ukraine. The same Russia invasion in Afghanistan, but the same issue in Ukraine. Let's not forget Afghanistan. Currently, our girls and women are not allowed to go to school, and even they cannot participate on social activities. They cannot go to job. They are very, in a very serious situation. So, if you look to the United Nations report, the recent report, they are saying that 80% of the narcotics are from have a supply chain from Afghanistan. The poverty has been in a very high percentage. How you can say that Afghanistan in 2021 in a Doha agreement was submitted officially to Taliban, but now the international community are asking about women rights from the Taliban, if even they knows that they are extremist groups. So how we can take a help, and how we expect from Taliban to have diplomatic relations with the world, and even they are in extremist groups. What is your opinion in this, in the same situation in Afghanistan, as well in Ukraine? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We just have barely 2 minutes to wrap this up. So, Sarah, can you, in 1 minute? The forgotten wars, like, you know.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Yes, I know we're short on time, but this is a really important point about being aware of what is happening in other parts of the world that aren't so much in the spotlight now or anymore. This example of Afghanistan, but there are other contexts where we aren't hearing as much happening, or contexts where there has been conflict and where there are survivors still today expecting and needing support. So I think what the ask is yes, it is extremely important to be aware of what is happening in Ukraine, how people are suffering, and we also need to be aware of the other places where people are also suffering from the effects of conflict. And it's dramatic, and it needs our attention. So thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to wrap it up because we're on the last seconds. But I think, but before I do the wrap up, can I come to you? I'm sure this question about how it seems the world is all focused on Ukraine is something you have an opinion about.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, well, just quickly, thank you I think it was more a comment than a question, of course. And I think it is extremely important now to challenge the international systems, whether they should remain the same or they should think about how to do things differently. And in terms of the wars happening in different parts of the world, I think this is the major learning the major thing that we are learning in Ukraine. The world is so fragile, and if 6 months ago or 8 months ago in Ukraine we were living in our peaceful, country and peaceful life, thinking that this will never happen with us. Now we know that it might happen tomorrow, anywhere, in any place in the world. So we have to be aware of this, and we have to learn from each other, and we have to support each other in this. Otherwise, we are in big danger.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your attention. And can I ask for a round of applause for our amazing panelists? I think it is important that we leave this venue convinced that the international humanitarian law framework is even more relevant in our time more than ever. I think it's important for us to keep in mind that people who are caught up in conflicts are not just victims. They have agency, and we need to invest in that agency. We need to listen to them, know what they need, and help them to be vanguards and first responders in their own protection. It is important that we're inclusive in this process. It is important that we understand we share a common humanity, and therefore, conflict everywhere is our concern. We must stand up for each other. We must bat for each other. Because, like a very popular Nigerian activist said, today's survivors can be tomorrow's victim. And when that time comes, may we have a system and people and voices to support us. Thank you and have a very good afternoon.